Great. Well, welcome everybody. I think we're going to start now, and big welcome to you all. I know we've got people from all over the world joining us. My name's Joanna Clarke. I'm the Director of Deaf Child Worldwide, which is the international arm of the National Deaf Children Society here in the UK. This is the second in a series of 5 webinars that we are producing and facilitating, and each of the webinars takes a little bit further the discussion that comes into each of the chapters of our Unheard Children report. And today's topic is to look a bit more closely at the situation of families. I'll come back to that in a national sign interpreters. I welcome Brigitte, Romy and Natasha, who will be signing for us today. If you have your own interpreter, you can pin them to the screen, and if you're not sure how to do this, we can tell you how to do this through chat. So without further ado, I just also want to talk a bit about the definitions we'll be using today. Obviously, our focus is families and how families support and are supported with their deaf children. So we will be using the term deafness, and we will be referring to language throughout the day. Now, I know there are different ways of interpreting deafness in particular in different parts of the world. But today, when we refer to deaf or deafness, we mean any level of deafness from mild to profound. And when we refer to language, we mean both sign and or spoken language, just so that that's clear. So today's topic is families. And before we introduce our speakers, or before I introduce them to you, I just want you all to have an opportunity to think about families. So what we're going to do is, I think we actually haven't looked at the agenda. Could we move the slide onto the agenda? So you can see that we will have speeches, we will have questions and answers, and we will have breakout sessions, as I've mentioned. So just before we move into the speeches and the presentations, I want to ask you all to see the white screen, which will come up in a moment on your screen. And for those of you who are joining by computer, you can look at the view options tab at the top of the screen. And if you go into that and click on annotate, and then on type, you can write a word onto the white screen. If you don't have that facility, or you're on a phone, please just write into the chat box. And what I'd like you to do is think of the word family, and without thinking too much, just write down the first word or words that come into your mind when you hear the word family. And we'll give you a minute to do this so that we can see on the board. If you put something in chat, somebody else will make sure that that is put onto the whiteboard as well. So please use the chat function if that's easier for you. That's great. Thank you. We're getting a lot of very positive words up on the screen, which is great to see. And of course, I think this just does represent the huge importance of families, however they're defined or constructed in everybody's life. And of course, families are the most important influence on any young child's development. And never have we seen, I think, the importance of families in the way that we have in the last year or so during the pandemic, where families have been absolutely at the center of everybody's lives. And this, you can interpret families in many ways, but they have been hugely important, and especially on closure of schools and all the issues that have surrounded dealing with a global pandemic. For deaf children, especially and particularly in low-income settings, the family is absolutely crucial. There may not be very many facilities, health facilities or social care facilities or teachers of the deaf, and the family takes on more and more of these roles, just as many families have done this last year. In our international work at Deaf Child Worldwide over the last 20 years, we've always worked closely with families for this very reason. We recognize how important they are. And when it comes to deaf children, it's especially important because more than 90% of deaf children will grow up in hearing families who really have no experience or knowledge of deafness. And along with our partner organizations in South Asia and East Africa, and up until a couple of years ago in Latin America, we have worked with our partners to bring parents of deaf children together to form parents groups where members can offer each other both emotional and practical support. Now, families are complex. We've all seen everybody has put some very positive words up there, but nevertheless, families can be very complex and they can be very complicated. And today we'll be looking at, we've got two great presentations, and we'll be looking at some of the challenges in the first presentation, some of the challenges and complexities that families face generally and in bringing up a deaf child, and some of the things that we all need to take into account when we are working with families. And our second speaker will tell us about her experiences as an active member of a very successful parents group in northern India. So we'll have quite a lot of food for thought by the end of our presentations. And I'm delighted now to introduce our first speaker. As people are speaking, you will probably think of questions you want to ask them. Please put those in the chat box, and we will have a short panel discussion after both presenters have had a chance to speak to you. So please just keep, as you think of questions, just put them in the chat box and we will try to coordinate that for the panel discussion. But back to Paola. As I say, I'm delighted to introduce her as a speaker. Paola is a process-orientated facilitator in the field of social transformation and learning. And she's been working for more than 20 years in the field of international development. As I mentioned earlier, Deaf Child Worldwide used to work in Latin America. We finished working there about two years or so ago. But during that time, Paola worked with us as a consultant and helped us facilitate networking between a whole range of parents groups in 4 South American countries: Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And although a lot of what she will talk to you about, I'm sure, will resonate with many of you. The observations specifically do come from over 2 years of facilitating discussions and work with families across those 4 countries. And Paola herself is Bolivian, and so came with a huge knowledge of the region. So without further ado, I will pass you across to Paola, and thank you very much, Paola.
Thank you so much for having me, Joanna, and everyone. Hello. I'm very delighted to be here and happy to having this opportunity to share the experience in Latin America. Too much to share, too little time, I would say, but we'll try our best. And hopefully this will be the beginning of many conversations, or the continuing of conversations and getting deeper into this huge topic, really interesting topic around families. So, okay, let me begin. It was interesting to see the words you came up with, and as Joanna said, very positive around family. If we would think, I will ask you just to think again of those words you put. If you can just go to the next slide, please. But I will ask you to go back and place a picture instead of words. Maybe you might have come up with something like this. And regardless of how many times I've asked people to do these, and even if our own experience may vary around family, we tend to imagine what we've been told it was the ideal around family. No, this is supported by a belief system. It's important to notice how much we are aware of these beliefs and how often we question them and what happens when we do it. Next, please. I believe that being unaware of these belief systems can really limit our understanding of the family dynamics as a whole, but also limit our contribution to real inclusion and equality. Next, please. So many of the organizations that works around disability place, as Joanna said, like families at the very center of all key strategies and actions, which is great. And we have plenty of successful stories where families do play a huge and meaningful role in the lives of deaf children and young people. In the field, some partner organizations and even families feel themselves are the way towards a world without barriers for deaf people and young people, instead of thinking it's just a way together with others, no conditions that need to be in place to bring about real change. Next, please. So one way of broadening up this way of analysis, we need to shift the focus. Of course, it's crucial to place deaf children and young people at the very center of everything we do, our analysis, decision making, and action. But we need to change the focus a bit for a few moments onto families and look closer to them to see what we might have been missing. Next, please. So this requires a lot of curiosity, of course, and a deep, deep commitment to learning. This requires us to sit and stay sometimes at the edge of discomfort and the uncertain, not knowing the answers, not knowing information and things like that, and not being clear about the next steps to take. Next, please. So what's good about unpacking or unfolding then? Here I'm sharing a few benefits of doing so, but I will focus more on the possibility of really addressing power and dynamics amongst the family members. And what is also key is managing assumptions. So we know that we cannot transform what we don't know, what we don't name, we don't talk about. Next, please. So if we open that box, we might really easily and quite straightforward look at the wide diversity of grouping and families and how people come together and form families. You will have single parent families, only sibling families, extended family, very young families, parents who are really old people, and also families from different world visions. That brings complexity, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but yes, we need to sit there and be amused to this diversity. Next, please. So the criteria we used for the Latin American experience was looking closer at the most immediate relationships around care. And we understood care as a role greater than one single person or a gender, but also looking at the vulnerability in the dynamic amongst members of the family. These in terms of power and rank, as I said, and also resilience and coping strategies. Next, please. So just to give a few examples of what could look like unpacking families. If you place a magnifier and focus on women especially, you will see that mainly women are fulfilling the role of care. They're the primary caregivers, as mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts, and even female domestic workers. And what is really important to see is that women's economic contribution in care work is overlooked. It is not really valued. And even more now in situations like the pandemic, this is being highlighted and brought it into the fore. So there's a pressure or sense of pressure of complying with certain forms of motherhood, and especially single women are seen as of less value in the community and the wider society. Women it's very often like listening to stories of women giving up self-care and their personal life projects to be just mothers, no? And although they can be proud about that, they don't see any social value to it. So that comes with a huge impact on their mental health. Next, please. If we look at men using this gender lens, of course, we need to look the situation of women as compared to the situation of men. We will see that mainly men fulfill the role of an economic provider. And although this is part of the care in a general sense, this is limited to it. There are recurrent stories of men abandoning families, and this comes with a lot of violence and trauma. There are exceptional cases of men as primary cases, and we need more of these as role models to society and families as a whole. Even if physically present, the men are less engaged in all aspects of care, as I said. And what I found really interesting is like there's a sense of fear, and which leads to little attention to the role of care in men. And this comes with fear of losing a few men involved already in care, or fear of being labeled as feminist or men haters sometimes, or the fear of giving up the ideal family. So it's important that to notice that belief systems about being a good woman or mother, a good man or father shape their own experience of men and women, but also the experiences of their sons and daughters, even deaf children and young people. Next, please. So I've mentioned female domestic workers, and it's interesting to see that most educated middle class and urban families can afford one or even more domestic workers. And this role is taken by mainly women coming from rural areas, indigenous peoples, or other ethnic minorities. It's important also to see that sometimes there's child domestic worker. This is a child domestic worker, and it's very likely that it will be a girl child. These people, although in very close relationship to the deaf children and young people, they are not formally considered part of the most immediate relationship of this circle. And their own struggles with childcare are normally overlooked. Next, please. There's the presence of indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities as families, right? But little attention has been put into their historical, individual, and collective discrimination as communities. Their situation of being migrants and their displacement, not only by the disability, but also due to climate change, conflict and violence are really little addressed. It's important to notice that in these cases, the sign language is their third language, sometimes their fourth. They have their own native language. They have a tradition of oral history. And as land workers, they seem to have a very reduced flexibility in their hands. So therefore, they struggle with signing. But they do have their own communication strategy, which sadly remain unnoticed. So there's a requirement of further research on these. Next, please. So around siblings, hearing friends, and hearing young relatives act as a bridge to the hearing world. It's really often seen that they are the most influential people to the hearing, especially teenagers and young people, more than many adults, especially around issues on identity, sexuality, and belonging. But do they really access reliable information and knowledge? They normally are seen as family appendix rather than key people to work with. And there's a belief system to that, no? Because we tend to look at families from a very adult-centric approach. Next, please. Again, youth is perceived by family members as the biggest challenge, especially to adults, due to many things. And I want to focus on the certainty around the future in terms of education and work paradigms, as they are in crisis right now, and even more exacerbated by the pandemic. But they also fear about losing their children to deaf community. And in relationship with the adults, young people, not only deaf teenagers and young people, but also their hearing siblings want more autonomy, trust, but also the respect of their own views around identity, sexuality, and work, and even family, how to form their own families. What is really critical to pay attention to is adults' own experiences and belief systems on identity and sexuality, which are really little or not explored at all. Next, please. So there's a tendency to focus on one disability, where in fact families tend to present multiple disabilities. There are common cases of siblings and adult members of families living with other disabilities or undiagnosed conditions. By doing this or having this in place, there's a sense in the family of fragmentation, that they are split apart in terms of their conditions, and also they feel a lot of pressure in terms of participation and engagement with different organizations, different activities taking place at the same time. Next, please. So there's a big assumption around families coming together, joining forces and collaborating to better cope with challenges of living with deafness, but also with other disabilities. There's a wide diversity of these forms of grouping, and they are called with different names, parents groups, mother groups, collectives, associations of families and friends at the national and regional level, networks, federation, platforms, etc. They all have their particular and specific trajectories, their own narratives and learning, and they wish there won't be such standardization of what they are. I think it is crucial to keep this diversity and show this diversity every time. So one thing I want to focus on is how they develop their leadership and types of the leadership that you can see in all these forms of grouping. You may have found easily in larger groups as regional networks and national networks that there's a more conventional leadership, which comes with having the chair as the figure of the father or a male figure, and which belongs to a more conventional family. This mirrors the socio-political culture, which values more the male leadership style than others, and also the conventional family. But if you see, as part of this larger group, you will see smaller groups of groupings and families where women are like leaders or leading these processes, and you will see emerging leadership styles coming from there. But women require a continuous support and equal conditions and opportunities to develop, to step into these roles and develop further their own leaderships as alternatives to the conventional style, right? Next, please. So to finish with, it's really important to bear in mind that all social cultural barriers faced by families and their members, including, of course, deaf children and young people, belong to the same structural and systemic mechanisms of discrimination and exclusion. So the question is big, I know, but it's really worth saying it. You know, can we continue to assume that families are the way towards a world without barriers for deaf children and young people, without considering their own individual and collective experiences of marginalization, as well as their own account and narratives of agency and resilience? It's key to not only capture them as struggling with those, but also their own ways of coping with them and succeeding in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paola. I mean, there's a lot of thought and information in there, and some really important points. And I am sure that anyone working with families will resonate very much, no matter where you are in the world. Can I just ask anybody, as I said before, anyone who has any questions, please put them into chat, and we will try and organize those for our panel discussion, which will come after we've seen our next speaker. I'm really delighted to introduce our next two speakers, in fact, who are mother and son, Protima and Boydonath, who are both involved in work and in a parents group that is run by one of our long-standing partners, Kaganat Welfare Organization, or KWO, as you'll see on the slide, up in the north of India. They've been working in the parents group for quite some time, and Protima will be telling you about this in a moment. The presentation has been recorded because internet connections can be quite erratic in that part of the world. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank Protima and Boydonath in advance very much for going to all the effort of getting this recording for us. And I'm sure you will all join with me in offering our very best wishes to everyone in India and in the wider South Asia area, who we know are tackling real challenges with the coronavirus pandemic at the moment. And we do send you all our best wishes, and are so very glad to see a lot of you here with us today. So without further ado, let us hear from Protima and Boydonath.
নমস্কার দিদি, আপনি কত বছর বয়সে বুঝতে পারলেন যে বৈদ্যনাথ কানে শুনতে পায় না বা বৈদ্যনাথ বধির?
আমার ছেলে যে বধির সেটা আমি বুঝতে পারলাম মোটামুটি 6 বছর বয়সে। কারণ আমার 3 বছর 2.5 বছর পর্যন্ত আমার ছেলে স্বাভাবিকভাবে ছিল।
কিভাবে আপনি শনাক্ত করলেন যে বৈদ্যনাথ বধির?
যখন বুঝতে পারলাম যে ছেলে আমার সাড়া দিচ্ছে না, তখন সবাই বলে যে কানে ডাক্তার দেখাও, কান নাক গলার ডাক্তার। সেখানে দেখাইলাম, তারপর আমি শিলিগুড়িতে নিয়ে যাই, সেখানে দেখাই। তো সেখানে তিনি কিচ্ছু বলে নেই, বলছে আগে টেস্ট করো। টেস্ট করার পরে বুঝতে পারলাম যে ও কানে শুনতে পারবে না, কথা বলতে পারবে না।
আপনার পরিবারে অন্য কোনো বধির ব্যক্তি ছিলেন, বা এই বিষয়টা সম্পূর্ণই আপনার কাছে নতুন বলে মনে হয়েছে?
না, আমাদের আগে কেউ ছিল না, এই বিষয়টা আমাদের নতুনই।
দিদি আপনার কিভাবে কেডাব্লিউর সাথে যোগাযোগ হলো?
আমার ছেলে যে টিচার ছিল দীনেশ দাস, ওর বন্ধু ছিল পরিমল, ও আবার কেডাব্লিউ ওর কর্মী ছিল। তো ওই কেডাব্লিউ ওর কর্মী মানে পরিমলরাই আবার দীনেশকে বলে, দীনেশ আবার আমাকে বলে যে তো বৌদি তোমার একজন এরকম বাচ্চা আছে, এইভাবে আমার সঙ্গে কেডাব্লিউ এর সঙ্গে মানে যোগাযোগ হয়।
দিদি আপনাদের মা বাবাদের দল সেটা কিসের জন্য?
আমাদের যে সমস্ত বৌদির বাচ্চা আছে তাদের একটা মা বাবা নিয়ে আমরা দল তৈরি করছি, যাতে আমরা বাচ্চাকে কিভাবে মানে পড়াবো, একে অপরের সাথে যোগাযোগ করব, আর সেই সম্পর্কে আলোচনা করব, ওর পাশে দাঁড়াবো। আবার কোনো অনেকের জন্য আবার আই কার্ড, তারপরে যে প্রতিনিধি সার্টিফিকেট বাইক করার জন্য অনেকে চেনে না জানে না, একে অপরের সাহায্য করব, তার জন্য আমরা একটা সংগঠন তৈরি করছি, তার নাম দিয়েছি আমরা আশা দল।
দিদি যারা আপনাদের দলের সঙ্গে যুক্ত নেই, এমন হয়তো কোনো মা বাবা আছে যাদের বধির সন্তান আছে, তাদেরকে আপনারা কিভাবে আপনাদের দলের সঙ্গে যুক্ত করবেন?
জানতে পারলাম যে একটা বাচ্চা বধির, তিনি বাবা মা আমাদের দলে নেই, তা আমরা সেখানে যাব, তাকে বুঝাবো যে এই বাচ্চাটা অন্য বাচ্চার থেকে মানে অবহেলা না, আমাদের বাচ্চাগুলো যেভাবে লেখাপড়া করে, হ্যাঁ এই বাচ্চাটাও লেখাপড়া করতে হবে, তার জন্য তোমাকে আমাদের দলে আসতে হবে, আমাদের সংগঠনে আসতে হবে। তার জন্য যে আমরা যেখানে যেখানে যাব তাকে ওর যা প্রয়োজন, এখানে দিদি জানি না এটা জানি না, তাকে আমরা সাহায্য করব, এইভাবে করে বুঝাইয়া আমাদের দলে আনতে হবে।
দিদি আপনারা যে দল তৈরি করেছেন সেই দলের আপনাদের নিজেদের মধ্যে বন্ধুত্ব আছে?
হ্যাঁ আছে।
তো আপনাদের যে এই বন্ধুত্বটা সেটা কিভাবে আপনারা তৈরি করলেন?
আমরা আশা দলের যে মিটিং করি সেখানে আসি, তারপরে ফোন নাম্বার কন্ট্যাক্ট নাম্বার নেওয়া হয়, যোগাযোগ করা হয়, ওর বাচ্চার একটু সমস্যা হলে দিদি এইটা বুঝতে পারি না, ও যেটা জানে আমাকে আমি জানাই ওকে, ওর যেটা সমস্যা হয় আমাকে জানাই, এইভাবে আমরা একে অপরের সাথে ঘনিষ্ঠ বন্ধু হয়ে উঠছি।
দিদি আপনাদের দল থেকে যে পশ্চিমবঙ্গের ডিসেবল কমিশনের কাছে গেছিলেন, তো সেই সম্পর্কে আপনি কি জানেন?
মানে আমাদের একবার সুযোগ আসে যে কমিশনের কাছে আমরা যেতে পারবো, তার জন্য আমাদের একজন প্রতিনিধি মাধবী সরকার যায়, সেখানে মানে কতগুলো দাবি জানানো হয়, যেমন হচ্ছে আমাদের বাচ্চাগুলা যাতে পরীক্ষার খাতার মধ্যে চিহ্ন থাকে বা কালার থাকে, যে পরীক্ষার খাতা দেখতে মানে বুঝতে পারে যে এটা বধির বাচ্চার খাতা। আলিপুর বা জলপাইগুড়ির মধ্যে যাতে একটা উন্নত মানের মেশিন তৈরি হয়, যাতে বাচ্চা জন্মের সাথে সাথে বোঝা যায় বাচ্চাটা বধির, তাহলে আমাদের ক্ষেত্রে আরও ভালো হয়। আমাদের দাবি জানানো হয় যে ক্লাস 5 থেকে যাতে 9 অবধি ইন্টারপ্রেটার বসানো হয় পরীক্ষার প্রশ্নপত্র বুঝে যাওয়ার জন্য।
আপনি একজন অন্য বধির মা বাবার কে কি আপনি উপদেশ দেবেন?
একজন বধির মা বাবাকে উপদেশ দিব যে এই বাচ্চা বধির হয়েছে বলে আপনার টেনশন হচ্ছে, এটার কোনো কারণ নাই। কারণ এই বাচ্চাকে প্রথমে তুমি বেড়া টেস্ট করাও, বেড়া টেস্ট করার পরে ওকে স্কুলে ভর্তি করাও, স্কুলে ভর্তি করানোর পরে স্কুলে যখন পড়াশোনা করতে অসুবিধা হবে তখন আমাদের দলে আসো, আসে এইখানে ট্রেনিং নাও, ট্রেনিং নেওয়ার পরে ওকে যে সাইনে আমরা ইসরা ভাষার মাধ্যমে পড়াশোনা করাই সেইভাবে ওকে বাচ্চাকে পড়াও। এই বাচ্চা আস্তে আস্তে বড় হয়, অন্য বাচ্চাগুলো যেমন আমাদের অনেক বাচ্চা তো মাধ্যমিক পাশ করলো, উচ্চ মাধ্যমিক পাশ করলো, এই বাচ্চাও একদিন মাধ্যমিক উচ্চ মাধ্যমিক পাশ করবে, তোমার এর জন্য কোনো ভয়ের চিন্তা নাই, সব জায়গায় ও একাই যাইতে পারবে।
দিদি আপনি বাড়ির অন্যরা যেমন ঠাকুরমা ঠাকুরদা কাকা কাকিমা দিদি এদেরকে আপনি কি উপদেশ দিবেন?
বাচ্চার হচ্ছে বাবা মা বাদ দিয়ে, বাবা মা তো একটু ইসে করবেই, ঠাকুরদা ঠাকুমা কাকা কাকি জ্যাঠা জেঠি দাদু দিদিমা ওদেরকে আমরা উপদেশ দিব যে ওদের আপনার আর যে নাতিগুলো আছে ওদের মতন ওকেও ভালোবাসুন, তাকেও আদর করুন, তাদেরকেও কাছে টেনে নিন, দেখবেন ওদের মতন ওরাও যেভাবে পড়াশোনা করছে এও সেইভাবে পড়াশোনা করবে, ওদের মতন এও মানুষ হয়ে উঠবে, একে কোনোদিনও অবহেলা করবেন না।
Thank you very much. That was great presentation, and I do hope that that Protima and Boydenath may have been able to see some of that and may have been able to join us, but we're not absolutely sure because of the difficult connections. But what I would like to say actually is also to congratulate Boydenath on passing his higher secondary exams. And just to put this in context, these are exams that not that many young people do actually pass, whether they're deaf or hearing. So that is a real achievement. And I'm sure you'll share with us in congratulating him on this. Also great to hear of the really sort of tangible changes that the parents group that Protima is part of have made and continue to make. And thank you again very much for such an inspiring presentation. I think we have been getting a few questions. Please, if you still have questions, please put them in the chat box. And I'd like to now welcome back Paula to be with us to answer any questions. And also joining us is Shampa Nath, who is our head of South Asia at Deaf Child Worldwide. And because we can't connect so easily with our partners in Northern India, Shampa, who has worked with us with Deaf Child Worldwide for several years, and will be able to answer a lot of the questions, I'm sure, related to our South Asia work. So maybe we could start with a question for Paula, which I think is a really interesting one. Hearing siblings, you're mentioning hearing siblings and friends and how important they are. And I wonder, Paula, if you'd like to say a bit more about how you think we can or should involve them more.
Yes, well, I think if the approach to family is very hierarchical, we tend to consult and call more the adults, mother and father, or grandparents, instead of the youth. And will be really critical to explore further what are the siblings' experience around deafness in their own understanding, and start a dialogue with them to see how they would support their deaf siblings, right? How they engage with deafness, how they bridge the two worlds and cultures, right? How they feel themselves as using both languages and these kind of things, and how they manage to bring information, key information to the deaf siblings, things like this. So I think it's crucial to have a separate conversation with the youth and listen to them, pay attention to their own stories about living with deafness in this case, but not only deafness, also other forms of disability. I hope that answers, at least to start new conversations, I guess, around this.
That's great, thanks. I don't know if Shampa, you'd like to add anything about working with siblings in particular from your experience.
Hello, everyone. So our work in South Asia, which covers India and Bangladesh, does include an element of including siblings in the work. So we, along with parents, we of course start off with deaf awareness with the family more broadly. Increasingly, we found that the involvement of siblings in supporting their deaf brother or sister is really great when it comes to education in particular, because most parents are have low literacy levels. And so the siblings are a great help in providing some support in terms of the studies at home, outside of school hours. Even in terms of communication support when they're out in the community, the siblings play a big role there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on to another question, which I think is definitely...
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, carry on.
Yes, can I add something?
Yes, please.
If we apply this intersectional approach to it, it's really important to notice the overload of work in terms of supporting a deaf sibling, right? Sister or brother. And to avoid these happening or being taken by especially sisters. And how this is distributed amongst family members, right? Otherwise, it's just replace the role of the mother and is taken by normally a sister, right? Just to add that.
Did you have any thoughts on that, Shamba?
I don't have any figures offhand in terms of the gender disparity, but I do know that there are some brothers involved. There probably are more female siblings in terms of the older siblings, especially once they finish their class 10 or the Madhyamik exams that was referred to in the video. Then the girl tends to be at home perhaps and has that much more time. So there possibly is, we haven't really gone into studying that more closely, but I would say that there are male siblings too who are supporting their deaf brothers and sisters.
Thank you very much. But I mean, perhaps following on slightly from this is an extension of the question as to, and particularly in relation to something you said, Shamba, how do you work with families with very, very low or no literacy?
So our support to families starts with the whole, it's not just about education and literacy. So it very much is about deaf awareness, because as we know, 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families. Then comes communication skills. So that's the primary aspect. And there you don't necessarily need the literacy aspect. It's sure when you get into the whole education side of things, then the literacy aspect does become more important or is more helpful. Having said that, at least when it comes to pre-primary and primary education, because of the deaf teaching methodologies or the resources that we've developed through our work, we found that works. Even the low literacy parents are able to use that to a great extent. And that helps not just the deaf child, but the hearing child as well. So it helps the family more generally. And so, the parents get that much more engaged. Admittedly, when they grow older, go into higher classes, then it gets more difficult because the concepts being explained are that much more complex. And that's where we're having to bring in parents who we call resource parents. So these are typically parents who have just maybe slightly more educated, have that much more time and inclination to get engaged. And so they've become, you could say, out of hours teaching assistants in the community to support deaf children who might not have their own parents there to support them with their studies.
Thank you, Shamba. Did you want to add anything, Paola, at all there? Okay, we've got quite a few questions and not too much time, but we'll try and address a number of them, perhaps together. I'm going to put two sort of questions together. One is about families being quite reluctant to work with us, with our partners, because of stigma. And I'm going to also link to that a question really about gender and what are the strategies for engaging fathers. I mean, these are both huge questions, really. But I just wonder, perhaps, Paola, if you wanted to address perhaps the issue about engaging fathers or men, which I know that some of the gender issues are quite familiar to a lot of us, and some quite specific ones from the work in South America.
Okay, I'll try. This is a very complex, and I think there's no one straightforward answer to it. No, it really depends on the context and all the variables. But for me, to begin with is let's have these conversations. Let's just frame that this is taking place. Let's just say out loud that we want to see more engagement of men in general and fathers in this role of care, and start a dialogue with them, so that they can also speak from themselves and talk about what they see as barriers they have to face. I've talked about these belief systems of what it means to be a good man or a good father, and how limited this role is for men to be the economic provider. So to begin with, not just how limited that could be perceived by men, and how there are men out there who are willing or wanted to be more engaged, but they are seen as too feminine, or they are not accepted as a more caring dad, for example, or caring man, because they are, again, conventions saying that shouldn't be the way of a man to behave, for example. So to question these things, to ask men why they are just accepting that role, or what are their dreams in becoming more engaged, would be a starting point.
Thank you, Paula. And maybe Shampa, linked to that, the other question that I raised, if families are reluctant to work with us or talk to people because of stigma. And I think that often does link in our experience to sort of gender issues. It may be the father who is not very happy about engaging. And I know in South Asia, a lot of the community workers who work for our partner organizations spend a lot of time in those early days, months, years of building up the sort of confidence of families. And I wondered if you had anything to say a bit more about that, Shampa.
So it admittedly is a long and slow process, as you've rightly pointed out. And so there's that regular engagement to the community workers, going and spending time with the families. Initially, it might just be the mother sitting there alongside the child when the community worker visits. What we've seen is it's as the child develops, the father is obviously seeing that child. It's of the child, the father, when he's seeing the change in the child. I think that is one turning point. So they realize, okay, a difference can be made to the life of my child, and I need to take an interest. And I have to say, the parents groups that Protima spoke about in her video, they play a very important role in terms of addressing the stigma, or even bringing other fathers or other parents around. Because when the parents say, you need to pay attention and support your child, change is possible, that's when parents sit up, more than if our partner organizations go and say that to parents. So the parents groups do play a very important role there.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this next question rather brings together some of the issues you've just been talking about, and it's really asking about what's the best approach is. Is it working with the family as a system, or with individual members of the family, and what are the pros and cons of both those approaches? Or I don't know who'd like to tackle that one. Maybe Paula to begin with.
It's a great thing. It's a great question, actually. I think both, and continuously, because if we keep family as a package, we see it as a homogeneous thing, right? If we unpack that, we are obliged to go into each single member and look at their own narratives, their understanding, and find out more. So someone is with the mic.
Hi, I think some people may still have their microphones on. Could I ask you to just switch them off, because we can hear you speaking over the speakers? If you could just mute yourselves, please. Thank you.
Speaker mark ಮಾಡಿ ನೋಡ್ರಿ, ಒಂದು ಗಿರಿ ಮಾಡ್ದಿ ನೋಡ್ರಿ.
Okay, I think.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Speaker ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಮೇಲ್ಗಡೆ, ಆ ಸ್ಪೀಕರ್ ನ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು.
Yeah, perhaps carry on, Paula.
Okay, so if we continue to take for granted all the diversity included in a family, we are marginalizing or invisibilizing their own personal trajectories, no? So as I said, behind family, or the term family, loads of women's contribution to the economy in terms of their care work is overlooked. If we just see family, we take for granted the fathers and men participation in the care work. So if we just really talk about the separated, we just address each individually, we might have different data information to work on, and we can act upon that. I think the crucial thing is just to unpack and then to shift continuously the focus. So the answer to that question is doing both, but continuously, not getting stuck in one side, but moving, make it in a fluid way.
Thank you, Paola. Anything you'd like to add to that, Champa?
No, just to say that I agree with Paola, because it's, I suppose, multi-layered and complex. So it can't be just one or the other. It has to be a combination of both.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I think we'll perhaps move on to possibly the last question, just because of time. But one of the questions is about the sort of additional support that's needed from society, government, medical staff, teachers. I should say, just to quickly flag up our next webinar, that we will be focusing on communities in that webinar. But I think, nevertheless, there's plenty to say on this. And if there's anything either of you would like to quickly say, we will be looking at that issue in more detail at the next webinar, and I'll give you information about that at the end of this one. So really the role of external community.
Shall I go?
Yes, I wonder perhaps if we just have a quick response from Champa on this about, maybe the wider resource groups and so on, which have really helped. Yeah.
So I'd say the external groups, again, just like you have the family as one layer outside of the deaf child, but the wider community is also very important, because the child doesn't live in isolation within their family. And so our work in South Asia, our model is very much working not in parallel, but together with supporting the existing structures. So whether it's the immediate community and the village, or it's with the health system, working with the health workers, primary clinics, the pre-primary schools, the primary, secondary education establishments, the government departments, our projects have all these different components built into them, because the deaf child, as they go through life, they're going to be interacting with all these different stakeholder groups. And so it's absolutely essential to be working with all of them and making them understand about deafness and deaf children and what is required for their development.
Okay, that's great. I mean, there's some really, thank you all very much for some very interesting questions. I think we could go on talking about this for a long time. And thank you very much to Paola and Champa for some really interesting insights into all of this. And I hope now that we can actually we can break up into in some breakout rooms and give you a chance to actually have a bit more of a conversation yourselves about some of the issues that have come up today. We will be putting you into groups. There will be titling in both of the groups, and one of the groups will have international sign interpreters. I should say we were hoping to have interpreters in both groups, but sadly one of our interpreters is not well today. So we'll just have interpreters in one group, and we've tried to divide you so that you do get the communication support you need. If you don't, or if you need anything else, please ask the facilitator of your group, and there will be people facilitating both groups, and they're all from Deaf Child Worldwide. They'll introduce themselves when you move into the rooms. I think you've already got lots of basis for discussion and conversation. We just flagged up a question to kick off the discussion, but it's not a mandatory question for the group. But thinking about, we've talked a lot about the family, and when we're talking about the family, in most cases, we're talking about hearing families and how they can support deaf children and young people. And there is a question about, if we're focusing on the family, how can we be sure that the benefits actually come to the deaf child? I think we've seen that, obviously, from our South Asia example, that just what the benefits can be. But I think it can be quite an interesting question. If we could just move to the next slide, I think it will give a few points on the breakout sessions. I think I've mentioned most of this. In a moment, you will see something on your screen asking you to join the room, and you just have to click join to do that. And the discussion will be for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back into a group just to finish up. It's only a 1.5 hour webinar. It's, there's always lots more to say by the time we finish. But I think this next few minutes is a chance for you to think about some of the questions or comments that you want to make, and have a bit of interaction with some of the other people on the webinar. So you should be receiving your invitation to join the breakout room any second now, I think. Hey, well, I do hope you managed to have some interesting discussion in the groups. I know that there's never enough time. We're not going to feed back to the larger group, because in our previous webinar, the feedback that we got was that people preferred to have more time in the smaller group sessions and to have a bit more interaction, which is sometimes quite hard to really do well on Zoom. But, it would be really good to get your feedback on what you think worked well, what you would like to see done differently at the next webinars. And we will be sending you a link to a survey after this, just a quick one. We would really appreciate your feedback, because as you can see, we have got some more webinars coming up. Again, we're focusing on the sort of chapters of the Unheard Children report, but as we've seen today and at every single webinar, all these issues are very much interrelated. But the next webinar, we will be focusing more on communities. How does the wider community, how can we work with the wider community? How can deaf children and young people work with the wider community and their families, to sort of particularly to really educate, inform, and reduce some of the misunderstandings which can result in quite a lot of stigma and discrimination. So there'll be some, I'm sure, very interesting discussions there, and the registration for that is open now. So please do have a look at our website, or we will be sending out invitations shortly. The next two webinars after that, as you can see, will be on education and on independence. So they will take place in September and October, respectively. We know that a lot of you who join are working with deaf children and young people and their families. Some of you may be thinking of working with deaf children and families, or wanting to make the sort of programs that you offer more accessible to deaf children and young people. And we do, Deaf Child Worldwide is offering training to anybody who would be sort of interested in learning more, perhaps on the next slide, please, about deaf children and their families, and ways of things to address, how to work and communicate with deaf young people. So there's a whole range of different training options there. So please do have a look at our website. What we would do if you were interested is talk to you and look at customizing some of the training so that it meets your particular needs. We are running out of time, and we will be finishing in a couple of minutes. Just to let you know that the main presentations, not the group discussions, but the main presentations will be going up on YouTube if you want to see them again. And we will be gathering some of the points and informations and discussion topics from your discussions and trying to continue some of that sharing of information on our blogs, on our website. So please do also look there, and we would love to always hear from you. If you have any comments or questions beyond today. So it just remains with me to thank you very much. Thank you to those of you who were at our first webinar and who have come back to our second, and thank you to those of you who joined us for the first time today. It's great to be able to interact with you, and we really look forward to seeing you at some of our future webinars as well. So thank you again very much, and hope to see you soon.